For our next speaker, they will be talking about that steamy scene, the making of. The awkward, technical, beautiful truth about shooting scenes of intimacy on screen. In this talk, we will address the misnomers around scenes of intimacy on screen. They will also talk about best practices and safety standards that are ideal to navigate scenes of intimacy, the creativity behind the choreography of scenes involving intimacy, and obstacles that one has to work with. They will also address the maker's gaze and how stories are told and what can urge creators to strive for more equitable, inclusive, and culturally open narratives. So our speaker for tonight is Aastha Khanna. Born and raised in India, Aastha, she or her, has always had a great passion for cinema. She graduated from the University of York in the year 2016 with a Bachelor of Science, honorable in film and television production. At the age of 26, she has already worked on many different formats of content in the UK and India. She has been an assistant director on over half a dozen feature films in India, including the very successful and national award-winning Adhantun Bad Sri Ram Raghavan. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. And currently, she is working as DA to Shakun Batra's next feature film set to release on 2021 this year. She has worked with international studios like Viacom 18, Netflix, RSVP, and Dharma Productions. She hopes to soon finish writing her own feature film and maybe direct one day in the very near future. Her journey to become India's first certified IC started in the year 2020 while she was designing a workshop for the actors on a feature film that has intimacy. On realizing that the Indian market didn't have a trained expert in the field of intimacy coordination, she jumped at the opportunity to train under the IPA in order to equip herself to bring about a revolution in the standards of safety sets on India. She has then gone on to become the founder of India's first intimacy professionals network called the Intimacy Collective. And with the help and support of the collective, she hopes to share the much needed knowledge and expertise of intimacy coordination across the different Indian film and television platforms. Everybody, please welcome Aastha Khanna.
Hello, hi, I'm Aastha Khanna for pronunciations. I'm a little bit brown, my hair is open, well, almost open. I do not wear any glasses. I am wearing black today. This description is for any visually impaired people that may be listening in. I would like to thank Justin for setting the bar so high for the talk today. I don't know how I'm going to be able to match that, Justin, but thank you so much. That was extremely informative. So I am India's first intimacy coordinator, and what does that mean? It's a slightly broader spectrum of things, but I thought I'll kind of start with who I am and what I do. So I'm basically the product of an accidental birth lottery because I've been dealt a great hand when it comes to family support structure in form of like close friends. They've facilitated a life for me that has given me the courage to make strong decisions that are against the current and to take up new challenges. Intimacy for me has always, intimacy for me was the most bizarre but most amazing accident in my life. I came to know of the job role when I was reading an article that was shared to me while I was assisting on a feature film in India. And while reading the article, I came to the realization that it marries two causes that I feel extremely strongly for, and three subjects that happen to be the pillar of the work that I do they're subjects of the human experience that are the most fascinating to me. I'm going to talk about the three subjects first. I'll tell you about the latter. So the three subjects are psychology, which is how the mind works, what that means for the sense of self, relationships, and the mind that builds itself and everything else around it. The second subject is law, which is the structure of society's moral compass, if you look at it like that. It's the drawn boundaries around any subject that has any form of contention attached to it. And film, which is the human invention that allows for creating and capturing and reviewing a life experience. It is a mirror or a reflection of society, and also a door that is open to aspiration. Um, these three subjects are the most influential in the work that I am able to do today. They're very uniquely weaved into the two causes that have been very personally impactful in my career to a very large extent. The empathy and the understanding of the world that we know today, and what we know that the world needs today. These two causes were the Me Too movement, and the cause for allyship towards the LGBTQIA plus community. The fact that in India, the importance of the LGBTQIA plus community and the struggle for them to find relevance in the legal system of India has taken a really long period of time, and only so began to happen in the year 2017, 2018, until before which identifying as somebody from the LGBTQIA plus community was considered illegal. And the Me Too movement happened in 2018. It took steam in 2017 and 18. It was around the time that I kind of got to put my voice to a cause that was impacting my industry and the one that I was working in directly. Being somebody who is a survivor from the Me Too movement, from sexual harassment in the workplace, I also did find myself in a very precarious position when I was kind of battling, trying to explain to the external world around me that my industry was a safe place for people to come to work in. And I was protecting my own workplace and kind of defending it. At the same time, I was struggling to kind of try and find a solution around how do you make a set or a place like our film industry a more safe space for people to kind of work in. When I landed on that epiphany, I decided to do something about it, and these three subjects and the two causes that I felt so much for gave me this undying urge to take up and pursue this generally unheard of job role, which is the job role of an intimacy coordinator. What followed for me was a series of gears that kind of fell in place and were able, that enabled me to kind of take on an entirely new profession, the challenge to build a whole other market in an industry. It's not about breaking into a new market. For me, it has been about building the market from scratch. And that challenge has been one that keeps me awake at night all the time. But let me talk a little bit about why we are having to face these challenges. So historically, if I am to talk about it, masculinity that has come down generations and has dominated the worldview. I mean, as what we call as patriarchy. Masculinity is associated with the idea of strength and is opposed to sensitivity. There is this overarching idea that a man is supposed to be aggressive with no space for emotions, or extending so far as to like a gendered classification of job roles. The patriarchal idea that the purpose of a woman's life is to serve the man, and while we live in the binary, the man is to be served by the woman with love and care, and very conveniently it shifts the burden of emotionality and affection onto the women, leaving the men to be portrayed as the lumberjack or the politician, or all positions of physical strength and power, like political, intellectual, physical, emotional power. The entire idea of this is all consuming for men themselves because it saves no space for weakness. And therefore, there's a portrayal of them even when reproducing their intellectual power, entailing visualizing or writing narratives that reinforce this patriarchy. That is what we, in a sense, call the male gaze, which is the fact that everything that we look at in the world today is with is from the eyes of the man, is from the eyes of the lawmakers, is from the eyes of the political leaders that are mostly heterosexual, cisgendered heterosexual males. The overarching factor of this extends to intimacy and that expression of desire, the desire of the emotionally vulnerable, the more sensitive and delicate sort of species, which then becomes the woman. These ideas have entirely kind of suppressed and, for the lack of a better word, not given value to the LGBTQIA plus community or the entire spectrum between the binary. And anything that does not kind of fit in that idea of patriarchy was systematically repressed through the ages, and their narratives were erased. So to kind of bring in a space wherein one is not viewing everything from the male gaze, there comes in the body of the female gaze or the feminist gaze, which is a more equitable gaze. The fact that when we shoot a particular scene, one is to look at it from the perspective of a power balance in terms of the power dynamic within the scene. And I mean, to speak to that female gaze and that feminist gaze, there is a beautiful talk that Joey Soloway spoke about, which I will link later on for everyone to go ahead and have a look at. I want to kind of also bring about, I want to kind of also mention what it means for sex and sexuality to be represented on screen in Asia. In Asia, in India, in the different countries in Asia. Specific to India, we've been a culture that has spoken about sexuality through murals, through temples, through architecture. There's a Sanskrit book called the Kama Sutra, which basically focuses on sexuality, eroticism, emotional fulfillment. And we've kind of had, I mean, the South Asian culture has been rich in music, art, literature, architecture, but there still remains a stigma that has surrounded sex and sexuality. Stemming from a tradition-bound conservative culture, conversations on sex and sexuality within the South Asian communities and the Asian communities at large have long been marked by shame, blame, and at its best, neglect. Experiencing sex and discovering one's sexuality is often a crucial part of growing up. The experience is very, very different for South Asians as to what it would be to anybody in the West or, the Western cultures. Because the concept of communicating about anything around sex, sexuality, or exploring anything to do with one's identity when it comes to gender and sexuality has been riddled by shame and blame, and to a very great extent has been completely discounted of its own value. So women have often been told to cover up, stay inside, act like they don't want attention if they're trying to if they're trying to communicate their sexuality, whether it is any child that wants to explore identifying and representing their gender and sexuality through means of clothing or attire, it has often been kind of suppressed. This is something that we show a lot when we discuss sex and sexuality within the platform of intimacy and intimacy choreography on screen. Having said all of this, I want to kind of discuss what urges a creator to strive for a more equitable, inclusive, culturally open narrative, one that is coming from a feminist gaze, one that is coming from a space of an equitable, more inclusive, more open space. I feel like it's very important for consumers and audiences to expect this out of the makers, to shun content and films that come from a place that are that are representing gender and sexuality in a titillating manner, or in a manner that is not respectful. It's very important to also recognize and understand diversity and identities, and be cognizant of appropriation when one is creating scenes and simulating scenarios within a story. So for those reasons, I always urge creators to make sure that they try to cast people from within the community when they're trying to represent people from within the community. That being just one example, there are a lot of other different ways in which this can be achieved. Having consultants and research teams or intimacy professionals there on board to kind of make sure that the right knowledge is reaching the creators, so that they are able to incorporate that knowledge and to create more realistic representations on screen. That's what brings me to kind of what the work role of an intimacy professional in its umbrella is. Intimacy choreography is something that is a very important aspect of an intimacy coordinator's job role. The world we live in today has voices, and intimacy is experienced by everyone, as opposed to just the male narrative. A scene of intimacy is a direct representation of the character's sexuality that shapes characters in their intimate moments with added vulnerability and sensitivity. And so for one to kind of choreograph a scene of intimacy creatively, one needs to keep all of those aspects in mind. Taking cognizance of the actor's consent and delivering an aesthetically pleasing, much real depiction that is true to character is a very important part of an intimacy coordinator's job role. So what are scenes of intimacy? What have I been talking about all along? Scenes of intimacy are scenes with intimate interactions that involve interactions with self and with other people, with or without nudity. These scenes include, but they're not limited to, scenes of nudity, simulated sex, touching, physical examinations, groping over clothing, dry humping, flirtation, simulated sexual harassment or violence, childbirth, pregnancy-related content, hypersexualization of body parts, what we call item songs in India, or what are called, just like, what would be a representation of, say, a stripper in a nightclub, or a drag queen in a drag show. Portrayals of hypersexualization of any kind of characters, intimacy, any kind of intimacy between minors, and familial relationships of minors and family. All of these kind of become very important to consider when we're considering a scene of intimacy. Intimacy on screen is really not as simple as it looks. I mean, there's awkward, sensitive environment where people are constantly feeling vulnerable and insecure of their bodies. If it's not provided with adequate support and safety, it can become extremely traumatizing. Intimacy is a central part of the human experience and a popular theme to explore and reflect upon by storytellers. So it's something that comes in and goes and has gone through in time, where storytellers have decided to use intimacy as a tool to kind of push forward their narrative. Nonetheless, working in intimacy can create or evoke physical, mental, emotional harm. That's where an IC kind of comes in. And intimacy choreographer, an intimacy coordinator, an IC is like a choreographer or like a stunt director. They're supposed to be there to kind of handhold the performers while also making sure that the director's vision is realized. So they're there to support the performers through scenes of intimacy, in emotional support or any kind of other support where they require whenever they're called upon to do so. It is about kind of making sure that the performers feel supported, they feel safeguarded from potential harassment or any kind of distress. The IC is hired by a production to kind of support the director's vision and to also safeguard the production to make sure that no legal hassles happen on a later date. Conversations around consent and boundary are clear and concise. And IC secures the production from any kind of unforeseen delays or lawsuits. The idea to have an IC on set is also to kind of create an equitable work environment where the crew feels safe when they're shooting any form of intimacy on set. And for those reasons, we like to say that, we, as in the collective, like to say intimacy coordination is about trying to create a brave space on film sets that entails advocating and ensuring consent conversations throughout the process. Consent simply means to give permission. And the collective that I've founded, which is the Intimacy Collective in India, borrows its inspiration from the pillars of consent of Planned Parenthood. There's an acronym called FRIES, which is one that I always like to discuss. FRIES is basically consent is FRIES. It's freely given, it's reversible, it's informed, it's enthusiastic or empowered, and it's specific. What does that exactly mean? These are the different 5 pillars of consent, and how can you give consent to something unless and until all of those 5 pillars have been kind of ticked off. So the idea of consent is based on boundaries. These function as limits that a person creates to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for others to behave around them. Performers cannot be considered as objects. I have a colleague, her name is Neha Vyas, and she very often uses this. This statement. She says that performers are not objects, they're instruments. And they have their own traumas and they have their own boundaries, and they differ from person to person, and they're culturally dependent. And IC recognizes those boundaries, and often the performers, and IC recognizes those boundaries of the performers, and they often seek their consent and functions according to what serves the production. It is like a roadmap or a body map that an IC draws around the performers in order to navigate that scene of intimacy. When we say we're talking about performers, we're talking about production. We have to also speak about what it means to be supportive to the crew on set. We always say that there is no hierarchy to respect. So to make sure that everybody who is standing there in that room is feeling comfortable, is feeling not triggered by the scene that we're shooting, is aware of everything and have consented to be there in that room, is also an important kind of back end aspect of an intimacy coordinator's role. So the idea is that the production company must kind of comply with relevant laws of the region to kind of bring the film to life. They have to make sure that guidelines and protocols around intimacy and the laws around labor have been upheld through that process. And thus, when working on scenes of intimacy, we must understand that performers are exposed to a risk of intimidation, body shaming, gender-based derision, any kind of physical damage, assault, sexual assault. And therefore, that risk assessment is a very important part of the producer's job role. So basically, how are these scenes shot? Understanding of detailed outline of these scenes, even when you're at a casting stage, conversations with director, making sure that scenes have been completely choreographed beat by beat, making sure that you're mapping all of the sex scenes and the intimacy scenes together with the performer, so the performers are kept involved and informed at all times. Not allowing improv on set, which happens to be something that directors really like to do. They like to leave things for the very end so that they can capture magic. So to try and reduce that capturing of magic as much as possible. There's always certain kinds of there's misnomers around scenes of intimacy in the audiences. Are these people naked? Are they actually having sex? Are they kissing really? Do they eventually end up in a situation where one has an erection? These are all questions that a lot of the viewers end up having, like, oh my God, how are they naked and walking around so many people? How do they do this? How do they shoot that? Are actors naked? No, they're not. They've been made to wear modesty garments. They feel comfortable. They've been given the required support when it comes to barriers being, as the word suggests, physical barriers between two performers and their genitalia. And are they naked always? No, not necessarily. It could be a body double, it could be CGI. There's a lot of kind of different ways in which one can imply nudity on screen. And I feel like there's a lot of questions around how we shoot scenes of intimacy, but I think what it really does boil down to eventually is the fact that, much like any other scene in cinema that is being shot, there is a large amount of detailed planning that goes into it. There is a lot of effort that goes into it from a lot of different departments that kind of come together to make a scene what it looks like on screen. And with the help of an intimacy professional, one can always make sure that everybody on that set or scene is feeling brave, is feeling comfortable, is proud of the product that has been eventually created. So I would like to kind of conclude by sharing with you that this profession and what I've gotten into is truly been the most valuable, life-changing experience for me. It has opened me up personally far more as a person than I was. I find myself a lot more in attunement with my own feelings, with my wants, my needs, to be able to bring that work to, to be able to bring that attitude to work. It requires for me to constantly work on myself as a person, to be able to communicate better in my own relationships, to be able to take cognizance of when I'm feeling triggered, working on that, communicating that with people, addressing issues that come to me in my own personal life. So, even with friends, with family, and, listening more, recognizing the needs of the people that are around me, and allowing for a space, a more brave space, a more safe space for people to come and communicate and to be able to build that trust with them. It is honestly one of the most deeply satisfying job roles that I have ever come across. And I truly urge everyone, whoever wishes to become an intimacy coordinator, to kind of take that on in their life. It was truly life-changing. And I believe, that the crux of your existence means something enough to bring about that change when what you've chosen as your profession ends up becoming your calling. So with that, I would like to kind of conclude my talk today, and I'd like to open up the floor to a few questions.
Thank you for that. Actually, I do have a question for you, since you mentioned in your bio that you would like to direct and write your own. So, if you had the opportunity to have your dream film, what would you like to write? How would you write it, and how would you like it to be directed?
Wow. How would I like to write it? For firsts, I would like a long holiday to be able to go to a place where I'm able to truly write without the outside noise of the world that I live in. But I would love to write, and I have been writing, and I can tell you a little bit about it, only a little bit. It's a story. It's a love story, drama between two people in the 70s, navigating the Indian, like with the overarching theme of the Indian politics around the 70s. But that's a story which is kind of inspired from my grandparents. So that is the story I am writing, and I would one day truly like to direct it. It has very little to do with actual on-screen intimacy, but it has a lot to do with navigating relationships and communicating, and is very nuanced in the cultural setting of India in the 70s. So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to kind of working towards.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any more questions or encouragement for Asata? Because as a fellow writer, I'm actually I'm an erotica poetry poet, and also
Wow.
a young adult writer, so I can relate with you in terms of your passion. So Martha has a
I would
question.
love to read. I would love to read some of your erotic poetry. Please send it along.
Okay, okay. Martha has a question. Want to know how you would deal with sexual violence, assault, violation during filming?
Sure. So much like every other scene, we kind of break the scene down and try and figure out how much of sexual assault or violence is required to be showcased on screen for it to be implied, and for the audience to get the effect that the director is working towards. Once that breakdown is in place, I usually like to have a workshop period with my performers in order to kind of run them through everything, and to make sure that I'm able to do some kind of trust building exercises between them, because it's very important for both the performers, or all of the performers, to have a lot of faith and trust in each other, especially in terms of when they're shooting scenes of sexual violence. Sexual violence scenes are always extremely triggering. They're triggering to the crew, they're triggering to the people that are making them, and of course they have the potential to be extremely harmful to the performers. So I always like to tell the performers to stay away from trying that concept of method acting, or needing to go to a place in their lives and to relive a certain experience in order to bring it to the table for sexual assault specifically. I try to kind of tell them to steer clear of that. And also to work with them in a place of their characters as opposed to them as people. So I kind of do something wherein I tell them to dissociate from themselves as a person with the help of like a check-in, check-out kind of process, when when you tap in your someone and your character, and then when you're done with the rehearsal, and when you're done with going through the beats of everything, then you can tap out, and you're a different person, and you're able to kind of compartmentalize your experience through that process. It's also extremely important to do check-ins, and I do very many of them during sexual assault scenes, because they are ideally, like, I mean, they are the most challenging scenes to kind of shoot. So I do a lot of check-ins. I make sure they get safe words. So much like, you know, in the case of BDSM, or when you're trying anything very creatively in your own personal lives, partners use safe words, right? We try and use safe words on set so that scene partners can tell each other, okay, this means I need a checkout time, I need 5 minutes. They're able to ask for a pause whenever they need to. And the narrative of how that is going to be shot, a lot of that power is given to the performers for those scenes. Of course, when you're working with the director understands the sensitivity of that, and allows for the actors in those situations to call for cut if they feel like they need to. So there are a lot of different kinds of protocols around around shooting scenes of any kind of sexual violence. But I think the most I think the overarching theme of it is to make sure that the performers feel like they're completely in control of their environment when they're putting themselves in a situation that involves any kind of sexual violence. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, there's another one. What happens if it has happened in a film you're working on sexual violence, assault, violation of the cast?
What happens if it has happened in a film you're working on? As in, if some kind of violation has happened?
I think that's what you meant.
If some kind of violation happens on a set, I've touch wood been very, very lucky in this regard, and have been able to kind of navigate situations before they reach a point of any kind of real damage having been caused. But I mean, of course, with intimacy coordinators are trained in bystander intervention. So if I can see something going wrong, I know exactly how to kind of deal with it. If somebody is feeling triggered at any point of time, I have training in mental health first aid. So I would be able to kind of help them navigate that trigger, and how to kind of deal with people in a situation when they are feeling triggered is very dependent on who they are as people. So it is extremely subjective. But if a scene like that happens and it gets captured on camera, for instance, then there is evidence to speak to. But however, there's sometimes that you know, it doesn't get captured on camera, and then it becomes a he said, she said kind of scenario. And that's when you kind of take to a point of making sure that that kind of situation is escalated to the authorities. When somebody is able to kind of talk to having felt uncomfortable in any kind of scenario, it is important that everybody who is around them testifies to that. And so, you know, one would escalate it, say, to the higher authorities, which is the production in this case, or to you know, like your heads of production, to the studio that has anti-harassment policies, and sexual harassment prevention committees. I think with us today we have our collective's expert on prevention of sexual harassment and redressal actually with us today in the talk, Asya, and she always talks about how it's extremely important to give sensitivity training in advance to all of the crew and make sure that they are in attunement with their surrounding and are aware of anything if it's happening and can flag it. So if it does happen, you're not just my eyes, there are a lot of other eyes on set kind of making sure that everything is happening as per plan, and anything that is not happening as per plan can get flagged then. So you try to prevent it as much as possible, but if in the case that it does not, that prevention does not work, then to support the performer becomes extremely important, and to make sure that they go and get the adequate help from a psychologist if they need it, or if they need adequate help in terms of legal, to make sure that they kind of get that help. The idea is to kind of support that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for